us the Professor Josh Hendrickson, Department of Economics, Associate Professor of Economics at Ole Miss. Good morning, sir. How are you? Welcome to the show.
Good.
Appreciate
Good,
it very, very much. Let's talk about, first of all, the debt ceiling. You heard on the news, and the story that I read was with Lindsey Graham, who has a problem with this, and also the Mississippi delegation in the Senate, Cindy Hyde-Smith, as well as Roger Wicker. But your thoughts on the debt ceiling package altogether?
So I think if you look at the raw numbers, the estimates in terms of, reductions in debt over the next 10 years are somewhere between like $800 billion and $1 trillion. And so on some level, that's a lot of money, but to put that in context, that's essentially enough money to pay for military spending next year. So on that level, maybe it's not that large. I think maybe the biggest problem here is that the debt is rising at an unsustainable rate. So when we think about government debt, economists usually think about it in terms of the debt to GDP ratio. And we do that because if debt is rising faster than the economy is growing, then the debt is getting harder to pay back. And if that ratio is really low, then maybe that doesn't really matter. But we're at a point where the debt to GDP ratio is 100%, and the CBO is saying that it's going to be 120% in 10 years. Other forecasts have it at 130%. And so this is just unable, and it's getting to a level where it's high enough that it could have repercussions.
It's a very good point. I would think if you wanted to drive an economist, a really good economist, crazy, have them go to work for the Department of Defense. I mean, they play with these numbers so much, it's really difficult. How do you grasp anything? Because when you talk about, okay, you shorted us $42 billion because that's where we figured in inflation, that's just going to bring us back to zero. Well, that's a moving target, one way or the other, depending on what the economy does. And to your point, if we don't cut the spending sooner or later, you don't worry about the economy; it's going to collapse. I mean, the inflation, the economy's going to collapse.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that you have to worry about is as you start accumulating more and more debt, what's the market for the debt? And for a typical country, the market really very swiftly imposes a limit on you by basically, you reach a certain level of debt and all of a sudden you wake up one morning and you try to borrow and you've got to pay, 10% interest or something and you can't afford it. The United States is fortunate in the sense that we have the global reserve currency of the world. And so there's greater demand for our currency and our debt than there is for other countries.
Yeah, but is that changing? I mean, does that scare you a little bit as far as the dollar's concerned? Because you hear all these rumors, and there are two things that scare me a little bit as a layman who doesn't know that much about this, to be honest with you. But the dollar not being the king scares me. Moving to a digital system of currency scares me a little bit. And the rest of the world saying, these people are weak over there, let's change things, would mean that some of our playing cards 5-10 years from now may not be what they are now.
Yeah, I think this is. I think the main thing here is there's a difference between can and should, and so the fact that we have the global reserve currency means that we can have higher levels of debt than other countries. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we should have higher levels of debt than those countries. And in fact, if you start to accumulate too much debt, or if you start to use the dollar as a tool of foreign policy, which the United States has increasingly done over the last decade and a half, then you risk undermining the dominance of the dollar, and with that, there's a lot of consequences, because if people aren't willing to hold dollars when the demand, if there's a massive reduction in the demand for dollars globally, then the value of the dollar falls. And not only that, but now, previous levels of debt that might have been sustainable are suddenly unsustainable. And so you don't want to be experiencing, you don't want to be experiencing those effects at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, and I heard some economist on one of the national programs say something about who do you go to borrow? Who's the big guy in town? I mean, everybody's broke. I mean, you got poor countries borrowing from other countries, and they're looking to get their money back, and everybody's in the same deal in some way or the other. And China, I don't know. What are your thoughts about China? How strong are they economically that they can weather the kind of storms that we can weather here?
Well, I think the main thing that we have to think about is like what is China trying to do, and I think that there's a wide variety of opinion on that. And if we think about could China challenge like the dominance of the dollar or something like that, right now the answer is no. But that's sort of independently they can't do that. But if they were to get together with a coalition of other countries, then they could potentially create trade relationships that would undermine the dollar's dominance.
Do you think they look at what's going on in Russia as far as Ukraine and see what's happening economically for the foreseeable future to Russia as any indication they would hold off on Taiwan?
I'm not sure how it affects their aspirations with respect to Taiwan, but it does give them the incentive to sort of play both sides, and it gives them the incentive to try to figure out how this is all going to work out. And in terms of going back to the debt, it also is going to give them some pause about buying U.S. government debt, because we saw that if you if you go against U.S. foreign policy, then they might, just freeze your assets or take your. And so if you're China, you're looking at that and thinking, well, if we do something that they don't like, are they going to do that to us? And so the natural thing to do is to start diversifying away from the dollar. And if you look at the data, that's exactly what they're doing. They're buying fewer dollars now than they were 10 years ago.
You know what the amazing thing is when you start talking about economists, too? When you look at these stories like Target or Budweiser, economists who work for these companies or any of the people, the chief financial officers, they can get together and they can put things on a piece of paper about this or that and leveraging this or that. But the equation in here is the buyer, the consumer. So, I mean, the buyer or the consumer is going to be the last person they influence. They can cut all kind of deals behind the scenes, but their big problem is the consumer. And you would think that most of these companies look at that and say, man, if this happens again, we don't want it to happen to us. $14 billion off the market capital from this company in just a few short weeks is amazing.
Yeah, I think this is a reflection of these ESG standards. And ESG.
What's your thoughts on that?
ESG is one of these things that sounds kind of innocuous, right? And maybe even virtuous in the sense that it's like, well, maybe if you're an investor, you care more just about the bottom line. Maybe you want to make sure you're investing in places that, aren't harming the environment, or that are socially conscious, or that, have good governance. The problem is practice. This gets entirely politicized. And also the ESG scores are entirely arbitrary. So if you look at like the governance score, so how well the company is run, FTX, the giant, fraudulent Ponzi scheme, had a higher governance score than ExxonMobil. And so does anybody think that a Ponzi scheme is run better than the largest oil company in the world? I don't think so. And so when it becomes entirely arbitrary like that, then, it ceases to have any sort of meaning. But if you have large entities who are basing investments on ESG scores, you have to try to manipulate your score to get to try to attract those dollars.
In other words, in any facet of government where they say people are independent, they're really not independent, one way or the other. Whether it's the Treasury, whether it's in Janet Yellen's Ballywick or anybody else. I got another question for you on this one. There was an update on the student loan scam, also known as the vote for me, I'll pay off your student loan bill. Part of the Senate's busy day yesterday included a vote to overturn President Joe Biden's student loan cancellation plan, 52-46 vote. Democratic Senators Joe Manchin, John Tester, and independent Kirsten Sinema all voted to overturn the plan, but the vote isn't expected to stop the plan going into effect. Your thoughts, economic professor, on the student loans? Will they get it or not? And if they do, is it a good idea? Coming back with more next. For joining us, did get some breaking news that the employment numbers are in for May. We've added 339,000 jobs, which is good news. 339,000 jobs in the month of May. Employment, healthy labor market, at least it's increasing. I've always heard that we needed about 250,000 just to stay level. I don't know if you've ever heard that, but about 225 to 250, 235 to 250 is what the market has to have just to stay at a zero basis.
Yeah, based on population growth, demographics, that sort of thing.
Yeah, people retiring, et cetera, or dying, one or the other. I do want to ask you about the student loan thing, though, because that do your students talk about that a lot?
Students, it's not really current students that talk about it. It's mostly former students. But I think the key issue here, though, is that if we think about the policies, if we actually wanted to do something serious about student loan debt, what we would do is we would allow people to discharge that debt in bankruptcy. But there's because if you think about the appeals that people make about why we should help people, it's, well, they went and got this degree, they ran up a bunch of debt, and now they can't get a job that allows them to afford that and that kind of thing. But the across the board debt forgiveness treats somebody who went to Harvard Law School the same as somebody who got some degree from an elite university that didn't get them a job. And that's not what the policy is, or at least it's not the claim that the policy is intended to fix, right? And so if we let people discharge it in bankruptcy, then only people who genuinely can't pay it back would bear the cost of the bankruptcy. But the bankruptcy would be, if they choose bankruptcy, it'd be better for them than the alternative.
We're talking with economics professor Josh Hendrickson of Ole Miss. And not only that, Professor, wouldn't that put more onus on the end game, the university, or the financing part of this to say, look, here are things that you can charge on here that are pertinent to education. You can't buy a car, you can't rent this, or refurbish your apartment, and more guidelines with and oversight would be put on there if there is a possibility of bankruptcy. And people should never forget this: the number one person who's responsible in the United States of America for putting that in that bill that you could not declare bankruptcy is Senator Joe Biden. Senator Joe Biden was the guy who put that in that bill, and he was proud of it. As a matter of fact, I have audio where he's proudly stating that. So people don't need to forget that. I have another question here too, and this is off what I wanted to talk about, but I just thought about this. You guys use AI and forecasting, or is that becoming a part of it, or are you worried about it, or is it something you're excited about?
So it hasn't really made it in yet, except in sort of primitive forms. I think it's one of these technologies where you can see potentially, huge productivity benefits. But then there's other aspects where you see these potential sort of dystopian visions of an AI future, right?
Yeah.
So the question is kind of, what are the limits to this thing and where does it go?
God, I guess the number one reason, and we haven't mentioned this morning, I'm sure most people have seen this, but it is a frightening story. I read it yesterday. I said, this can't be, but apparently it is. And I'm talking about here, let me see if I can follow here. I'll have to just do it extemporaneously because where they sent the drones out to kill to attack the SAM missiles. Did you see that?
I didn't see it.
They sent the drones out to take out. This was just a simulation. The drones were supposed to take out the SAM missiles, and when the SAM missiles were going to be taken out, the drone realized that it was going to be taken out too. So it turned on the people. I have to find that somewhere in here, but it's absolutely a scary thought where the AI drone missiles turned up on the people who were doing this. But it's a fabulous story. All right, well, let me get back one more question here as far as where we go with this, and as far as the debt limit in our state. Do you guys concentrate on that, and you start looking at where we are in the state of Mississippi as far as taxes and everything else?
What do you mean?
I'm talking about you get involved as far as looking at it from a legislative basis, where we are economically in the state of Mississippi, and can we cut taxes more? Did you ever get involved in that debate?
Yeah. So a couple of years ago, when the proposal to eliminate the income tax and create a consumption tax came into being, I wrote a policy paper with one of my colleagues.
Did you?
About this, and
you
spoke to people in Jackson about it. Yeah.
You have to come back on because I want to spend more time with you if you would. Great job, and I thank you so very much, and I'd love to have you back on. I got to find that story here too, though. Thank you so very much, Josh. Appreciate it, Professor Josh Hendrickson.